Roosevelt with Hitler. He tried to live in peace, but old Hitler, he was destroying every vessel he could see. He was treating us so mean with the dreadful submarine. That strange things are happening in this land. Hitler, he was fighting, he's making every charge, trying to win that victory so the land might be enlarged. He's fighting everywhere, on land and in the air. That strange things are happening in this land. How strange things are happening in this land, oh Lord. The war is going on, cause the men your hearts to mourn. That strange things are happening in this land.
Okay, well, welcome to the second Lawyers, Guns, and Money podcast, broadcasting from beautiful Denton, Texas, home of such bands ranging from Centromatic to Midlake, evidently Wayne Hancock, Raymond Train, to Pat Boone. Yeah, let's not forget.
No, never forget Pat Boone.
So we're here today talking about, we're going to do a review of the NFL season, talk about the Super Bowl a little bit, and as you may be able to tell, the person next to me is vaguely related. This is my brother Daryl Loomis. Daryl is a noted film reviewer at the site dvdverdict.com, where you can read the musings of Judge Daryl Loomis. And we wanted to get into a few topics today, but the first one I want to talk about is just kind of review the season, some of the major issues around the season. So, Daryl, what are some of your thoughts about the season?
Okay, so we're going to start by saying that because, we're just getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but since we're within the realm of the Harbowl, this is officially the Loomcast.
Loomcast.
But getting started out, let's look at how the season started. And the season obviously started with the referee lockout and the issues of the questionable issues of the NFL's player safety directive. When the refs, who are complete professionals, aren't allowed to do their job because of whatever pay issues and whatever things we're not going to get into here. Any idea that the NFL actually cares about the player's safety beyond the idea of a talking point when it compares to the money that goes into paying the referees goes out the window. I mean, Eric, what do you think?
It's a joke, right? I mean, these referees, the amount that they were asking for, which really, again, the major issue was keeping their pension plan. Right? With the NFL, these are billionaires, and the issue is obviously crushing a union. That's clearly what was going on here. And, it's not like anybody really took the NFL serious on player safety anyway. Right? Everybody knew it was a joke, but this just proved how meaningless it is, at least in the larger owner desire to maximize profits at the expense of labor, which, of course, anytime I'm on anything, we're going to bring it back to labor relations, but that's really what's happening here with the NFL.
Well, and given the obscene profits that they're making on the face.
Right, exactly. This is not a money-losing proposition.
Paying the referees a wage where they don't have to where they don't have to work during the off-season. Right. Is not a deal breaker for any of these owners.
Right, and most of them do work during the offseason. It's not that much money, But what was happening especially by week 2, week 3, as this is getting more and more ridiculous, is that it's clear that these replacements, these scab referees had no idea what they were doing. Were totally, people who'd been rejected from Powerpuff Football League. And and both offensive and defensive coordinators were coaching their players to play harder and rougher and meaner because they could get away with it, and because it was not going to be called. And so that's what was happening. So we don't want to focus too much on that. But then the other issue around this, two. One is, of course, that it threw the game from the Packers to the Seahawks in what turned out to be a very important playoff. A game with important playoff implications down the road, even if my Seahawks were the lucky recipients of that. But
they totally caught that ball.
Totally caught the ball, exactly. Best catch ever. But also going into these larger issues of player safety, where you have people at this point now that especially after the suicide junior Seau, but so many others, as well as dementia and these sorts of things and lawsuits against the league are basically saying and the NFL may be we may be in the last generation of the NFL. Is football going to die? Now I'm very skeptical about this for a number of reasons, but I don't know what thoughts you have about these issues of player safety.
Well, the player safety issues are seriously important, and now with the incoming idea that we can track for CTE while the person is still alive. Now, whether that's in football or boxing or mixed martial arts, which are all very very damaging to the brain, these are things that are going to become larger and larger issues as time goes on. There's always going to be a problem where the dream of huge success, money, getting a big house, getting a nice car is going to overtake the idea of 15, 20, 25 years in the future that people are actually going to say, my future is more important than my present. How often does that actually happen?
Right. Especially with people like the majority of NFL players who come, or a large percentage of NFL players anyway, who come from relatively poor backgrounds.
Yeah, coming out of poverty, and that's not to get into a boxing discussion, which we're not going to get into, but that's where American boxers come from, and not just American boxers, but boxers worldwide.
Right.
They get into this because it's a way out, and that way out is more important in the short term than in the long term. And no matter how much information they might have about who is or how their future is, what their future is going to hold for their brains, the excitement of football, the idea of getting out, and the amount of money that's being thrown not just at them but at colleges all the way down to Pop Warner level are going to be enticing kids, coaches, owners, whomever to continue this issue. So I don't think there's any real danger of losing football, even though that's
maybe that should happen. I mean, it's entirely possible. Even as a huge fan, that should happen. But
completely morally ambiguous.
But the cultural importance of football to the United States is huge. And yeah, sure, maybe you're going to have wealthy kids, in Greenwich, Connecticut, whose parents aren't going to let them play football because my kid's not going to do that. But how many wealthy kids are in the NFL anyway? There are some, right? Yeah. Peyton Manning's wealthy. He grew up wealthy, but then his father was a football player anyway. So I just think that it's not going to have that big of a difference. And I think people like blood sports, and it's not like there's been any significant reduction in the fan base at this point. Now, is it possible? Yes. I mean, I think that the thing about American football is that it's a game of questionable morality on a number of levels, whether it's the NCAA, basically stealing the labor of young black men, to the NFL and player safety, to the kind of cultural, masculine implications of football. But at the same time, we grow up with it, and it's hard to totally turn your back on the kinds of things that you grow up with, even if you recognize that there are some pretty serious problems with that. But to kind of focus on one particular issue of player safety, I think that there's the head injuries, but then there's also the general treatment of players, and this leads us to Robert Griffin. And I think what happened to him in the playoff game between the Redskins and Seahawks was deeply problematic.
Well, some of the so there's two things going on. Obviously, like Eric said, it's not a head issue, but you have a juxtaposition between a couple of years. You have this year with Robert Griffin and the lovely Mike Shanahan, who, as a Bronco fan, I did care for a long time, but then began to quickly realize.
Well, why? Well, let me just curious. Why did you turn on the coach who brought you 2 Super Bowls?
Well, he's a coach who values his guys. He's kind of like Buck Showalter in Major League Baseball. His guys get preferential treatment. And so what you wound up seeing after Mike Shanahan left the Broncos was a trio of players, Jay Cutler, who I'm actually going to get into in a second, Brandon Marshall, and Tony Scheffler, all of whom basically said, you know what, Broncos, go to hell. I'm going to punt the ball in practice. I'm going to not care about the team. I'm going to complain and complain and complain about this new coach. And then that new coach did not succeed very much in Josh McDaniels. Fair enough. but
Are you telling me drafting Tim Tebow wasn't a brilliant move?
Oh, I've been Tebowing for 2 years. So
Tebow,
don't tell me.
Yeah.
Don't tell me. But so when he finally gets to the Redskins, he's able to implement his offense. He's got, like he had with the Broncos, both coaching and administrative power, and so he is the one who makes the decisions. And so when Robert Griffin hurts his knee in, I don't know, what was it, week 13 or 14?
Yeah, 14, maybe even 15.
But hurts his knee, can barely run, and when you could see this in game to game after Kirk Cousins got benched again and he came back in, the man could barely run. Yeah. But Shanahan continued to put him out there, continued to stress that knee, and when it comes to playoff time, he is damaged. And now, will he be back for the start of the regular season?
I think that's pretty unlikely. It's like a 12-month. I mean, I think the question is, will he come back at all next season?
Is he Adrian Peterson and can come back in 6 months?
Right.
Or is he done?
Yeah.
Is he never going to be able to be the running quarterback, the excitement that he was, to start the season?
And with modern surgery, he probably will be. But I think that you have a special player there. You have a player who, I'm not saying, I think this idea of one in a generation player, let's talking about Bo Jackson or Jim Brown or somebody who's, a complete freak, even for compared to other amazing athletes. But, so I don't want to use that term, but a truly gifted player who led your, let's face it, pretty bad team in many parts of the ball, or many parts of the game, to the playoffs. And you put that at risk for a short-term potential win when you have a perfectly capable backup quarterback. I mean, and that's an irrelevant issue ultimately because we're talking about a player's future here. But it's not like the Redskins had Dan Orlovsky back there, right?
It's not
they
like
had Kirk Cousins, who had done.
Jets were looking at.
Yeah, right. There's no Greg McElroy or Tebow, for God's sake, right? So it's so even outside of the morality of risking your player's health and the longer-term issues of risking your franchise's future, in the short term, Kirk Cousins gave them a better chance to win. And to me, that was one of the great disgraces of the year, even though, like the other great disgrace, the Seahawks benefited from it. So,
right.
Maybe I shouldn't complain, but you certainly don't want to see that. I think that Shanahan, I think that what happens a lot of times with successful NFL coaches is that they win, and they win for a number of reasons. Having John Elway as your quarterback, horseface as he is, is something that not every coach has, and so the idea that because Shanahan won with Elway, he's this god of coaches and he can do whatever he wants to, doesn't mean that he should be able to do whatever he wants to. Just like you see with people like Mike Holmgren, whose tenure at the beginning in Seattle before they had GM was a disaster, whose tenure in Cleveland was horrible. He's not good at player management, player personnel, and neither is Shanahan. And so I think that I think this idea that the team should give coaches this maximum control, I think it's really problematic because of their egos, because sometimes these guys need a check, and because they often make major terrible decisions that put people like Robert Griffin at risk.
Well, and on top of that, accepting Mike Shanahan and all of his myriad faults and his general assishness is the idea that it was a couple of years ago where Jay Cutler was in the playoffs and hurt himself and went to the locker room and came back and didn't actually return to the game.
He was already at the Bears at this time,
with
right?
the Bears,
Right.
So he was shot. He was found on the sidelines joking with players, walking relatively normally, and the NFL media basically universally called him a coward. And so there's this other issue of the heroism of the quarterback, where you're basically telling Robert Griffin, if you don't go out and play on your hurt knee, if you don't risk your NFL future for this single 60 minutes of football, you're a coward and you don't deserve to be part of this league.
Yeah.
And I think that's as big an issue when we're talking about player safety, and when you talk about, when these surveys come out of current NFL players about hiding concussions and deciding that I'm going to put my future, my entire future, not just my NFL career, but my future as a human being at risk so that these 60 minutes of football can be played to their highest. And then the other problem is that are they actually being played at their highest?
Wow,
because
right.
you're addled. You know, it's like going to the locker room and having half a pint of scotch and coming back into the game and saying, well, just because I'm a little bit drunk doesn't mean I'm not, I don't know, Ray Lewis. I'm not that guy. I'm still Ray Lewis in name, but your brains are addled. Yeah. How can you possibly still be there? And it's
you're talking about concussions here.
With concussions,
yeah.
Not just going to the back and drinking scotch.
Right.
That might be my answer to a hard hit, but probably not most NFL players.
Right.
But the point
except for Lendale White,
maybe Lendale White.
So.
But if but the impetus has to be on the coaches and the training staff to say to a player, look, you're not a coward. You can sit. You don't have to be the hero because we've got 72 heroes on this team.
And that's why, or 50.
53.
But I think that's why two things that brings up. One is that you absolutely have to have completely independent decision makers on who goes into a game and who doesn't. The coaches can have nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
The NFL maybe doesn't. It needs to be an independent governing body that decides whether these people can play. So that is, so that's, and the other issue. Sorry, quick brain freeze there. The other issue is the issue of masculinity in the game, and because this idea of you have to go out and play hurt and all of that. Yes, that's part of player culture, but the media and the fans absolutely are the base of this, right? When you are pillarizing somebody like Cutler in the media, who's a dislikable guy on a number of levels anyway, that doesn't help. But when you're basically calling somebody a coward for not playing, you are reinforcing with very powerful voices. People like Skip Bayless, let's say, a very powerful voice. Disturbing voice.
Disgusting voice.
Disturbing, but I always hope his brother Rick serves some Taco Bell at Thanksgiving, but it's a really terrible thing, and it reinforces this entire culture of maximum masculinity. So we could go on about this all day. We should probably talk about some issues that are a little bit more fun. I mean, I think it's a sign of where the NFL is at right now that we've been talking about pretty negative things for 15 minutes, and that's unfortunate. But we should sort of move along, I think, to some other issues, and one of which, of course, is a new generation of quarterbacks in the league. And I think that is something that's been very, very clear, after a few years maybe where you didn't have a lot of high-impact quarterbacks. You have a second-year player called Kaepernick, who's very quickly becoming one of the NFL's dominant players. You have three outstanding rookie quarterbacks in Andrew Luck, despite a rather poor completion percentage, but I'm not too worried about that. Griffin and Russell Wilson of my Seattle Seahawks. It's clear that to a certain extent torches are beginning to be passed. There's a lot of very young quarterbacks with incredibly promising futures, as well as people who are sort of the mid-20s like Matt Ryan, who obviously we'll get to. We'll probably talk about here a little bit, but so I think that's certainly one of the big issues. And if you have any thoughts about the sort of the quarterback situation in the league right now?
Well, some of what happens is that over the last say 7 or 8 years, you've seen with the failure of Vince Young that what once was in
the
NFL,
still in the league?
No,
he's
okay. Looking for a job.
Oh, okay,
but what once was and what is now. So when Vince Young comes out of Texas into the NFL, he is basically forced into a system, a traditional I formation NFL system that he was never taught to play.
Yeah.
And he's the one called the failure for not being able to play in a system that he's never been taught. And
Jeff Fisher is an excellent coach.
Yes.
Right, but Jeff Fisher was not the coach for Vince Young.
No, and Jeff Fisher's offense certainly wasn't the offense for Vince Young. And what Vince Young ran at Texas was nothing new. The spread style offenses in college had become ever present for years before this ever was an issue in the NFL. And so soon as players came in and didn't know how to take a snap under center, I would imagine that coaches and coordinators were disgusted by the players' inability to do this simple thing that they were all taught to do. Sort of like when Ted Williams was the manager of the Rangers,
right,
and said, why aren't you guys hitting better? Let me show you how to hit. And then he'd hit a bunch of balls in batting practice and give them a bat and say, do this. But players are taught from the earliest levels, from middle school and high school into college, that this spread is the way to score points, it's the way to gain yards. And so now, finally, the slow-mindedness and nearsightedness of the NFL has finally caught up to the players that are coming into the league.
Well, and not surprisingly, it's coming through a lot of college coaches, right? It's Jim Harbaugh, it's Pete Carroll. I mean, these are people who saw on the ground how to make this work, and now, of course, Chip Kelly.
Poor Chip Kelly.
I know.
In his situation in Philadelphia, but we'll get to that in a second. The point is that Colin Kaepernick is successful because Harbaugh is allowing him to be successful in doing what he knows how to do. And what he knows how to do is dynamic. And Shanahan, for everything that's wrong with him, did the same thing with Robert Griffin, allowing them to do what they were taught to do.
Well, and that's why I think that in part Harbaugh's draft strategy made so much sense this year, over the last couple of years, because he has a Kaepernick, he sees the future, and of course, I mean, one of the big stories of the year as well is Harbaugh making a midseason switch from a veteran quarterback who, at least under Harbaugh, is an above-average quarterback to an unproven player. But you draft a guy like Kaepernick, and then you have a very old-school, traditional running back in Frank Gore, who really is not that ideal of a back for this kind of offense. But then you draft LaMichael James in the second round. And they sat him at first, but then he was adding a pretty useful dynamic in these late season games. This is part of why the 49ers have done so well. It's not that LaMichael James has huge yards; it's that LaMichael James knows how to run a spread offense.
Right.
So what's happening is that on a lot of plays, because especially with the Packers game, right, where Dom Capers had clearly not watched any videotape of any offense since about 1987.
Why would he need to? It's all gimmicks, right?
So they're just doing fake hand, or they're basically doing a zone read, letting LaMichael James run up the middle, get slammed, but LaMichael doesn't have the ball, and Kaepernick's running for another 60 yards. And so I think that you're really seeing a certain generation of coaches really bring not only new offense but an entirely new way of thinking to the NFL, and that's why it's not surprising that these teams like San Francisco and like Seattle, especially a team like Seattle, where they weren't, not much was expected of them this year, have really been able to have quite a good season and a wonderful future, is in part because you have a willingness among a generation of coaches that has been in the college game to bring in these ideas.
Well, and to go a little bit farther, when we're talking about the future, and we're talking about old Oregon Chip Kelly,
Go Ducks,
our old friends, hook 'em Ducks, as they say in Texas. The idea, there's two ideas. What is he going to do when he's with Philadelphia? There's all sorts of questions. Is Michael Vick going to be there? None of us know that. What we do know, though, is that he has Bill Belichick for the Patriots has come out consulting Chip Kelly on how to run this high-level, high-speed offense.
Right. I mean, the no-huddle speed-up offense that the Patriots were running this year was incredibly effective, and that came straight out of meetings between Belichick and Chip Kelly.
And they're very, I would imagine, very similar personalities in certain ways.
Right.
Both very aloof.
You don't actually want to know either of them, but they're good coaches.
They're good coaches, and but that brings me to another question. And if Belichick is keeping his job in the going forward for the next 5, 6, 7 years, how much does Tom Brady have left to actually contribute to this offense? He's obviously a good play caller. He's obviously a good quarterback. There's no question about that. But if the Patriots are going to run this Chip Kelly style offense, does slow old Tom Brady actually fit in anymore?
I don't think it matters much, honestly, because I think that, something like Belichick, something like Chip Kelly. I mean, Chip Kelly's quarterback next year may very well be Nick Foles. Nick Foles, who was a promising rookie in his own right and did quite better than I thought he would, frankly, having seen him in college a lot.
Chip Kelly was effusive of him when he was in college.
Oh yeah, no, but I think that Nick Foles is not the ideal guy to run a spread offense. But I think that what's important to note about both Kelly and Belichick is that what they're looking for is basically inefficiencies, right? They're looking to exploit defenses, and that can happen through, and speed is the way to do that, but that can happen in a number of ways. And so you take the personnel that you have, and I think that what the Eagles have with somebody like Chip Kelly is somebody who's actually going to be able to exploit somebody like Deshaun Jackson, not to mention LaShawn McCoy.
Right.
In ways, LaShawn McCoy in a Chip Kelly offense, like if I'm a defensive coordinator, if I'm a defensive coordinator, I'm a little bit nervous about that. I mean, because and Deshaun Jackson, who's been somewhat of a disappointing player over the last couple of years, these could be a big career revival for somebody like that, somebody like Jeremy Maclin, and so I think that and not to mention Bryce Brown, who somewhat interestingly was Chip Kelly attempted to recruit out of high school, which was a total disaster because Bryce Brown really didn't do things like go to college. Right. So and was sort of a total mess everywhere he went. But Bryce Brown was a big when McCoy got hurt at the end of the year. Bryce Brown was a huge surprise. And so there's a lot of weapons on that Eagles team. Now, I'm not enough of an expert on the Eagles to know really what the defense is, and I know their offensive line has been rather poor, as I recall, over the last few years. So obviously that team needs work. I mean, there's a reason that they were bad. But there's a lot of weapons for Chip Kelly, and I think with Belichick, he's going to produce... he's going to use an aging Tom Brady in the most efficient way possible to exploit these defenses, which he was able to do this year. I mean, the fact that the Patriots did not beat the Ravens does not mean the Patriots are done.
No, and I'm not saying that. I'm just wondering in the future, like when is Bill Belichick and the powers that be in New England going to finally decide they need to get somebody behind him?
Well, it's probably time to start. I mean, part of this depends on your Brady situation. I mean, and how. And I think that the good thing about Belichick in this situation is that he's not going to put up with a Brett Favre-like attitude toward a young Aaron Rodgers, right? I mean, he's basically going to be, he's clearly in control there. It's not a situation where you're going to have, like had happened in Green Bay, an ultra alpha quarterback. Basically try to shun the future and become a media circus around it. Belichick's obviously not going to put up with that. But it probably is time that the Patriots begin to get serious about developing a new quarterback. Look, the Colts got incredibly lucky because Peyton was hurt, they were horrible, and they happened to get the number one pick in a year where Andrew Luck is the top choice. This year, the Chiefs are horrible, and the Cardinals, and their quarterback situations are abysmal. You're going to draft Barkley?
You're not going to draft
Geno Smith? And these are incredibly problematic quarterbacks. And so the fact of the matter is that the Colts getting Andrew Luck is almost like the Spurs getting Tim Duncan the one year that David Robinson was hurt. Right? It's like, oh, well, you just, through sheer luck, it just faded yourself into another decade of quality football. Well, good for you, Colts, but if you're the Chiefs, that's a problem.
Yeah.
So I think that I always am surprised at how little teams really prepare for the future, and I think that much to the Packers' great credit, when they drafted Aaron Rodgers, they knew the situation that was going to develop, and they knew they had to look into the future. And look, the Packers have a Super Bowl under Rodgers. I mean, the Packers have the problems of their own. Their defense is not exactly good. Their running game isn't good. I mean, they're team in a little bit of transition. But as long as they've been Rodgers, they're going to be very, and in that receiving core, they're going to be very competitive. And so I think that clearly, I think that it's if I was the Patriots, I might consider a third round pick on somebody like Matt Nassam, I think is his name, out of Syracuse or somebody like that, who you might develop into, who might sit for a few years and be totally fine with that. And then if Brady's still awesome at the age of 3 years from now, well, you can trade him because certainly somebody like Seattle with Matt Flynn is going to be in a really good position this year to trade to something like Kansas City or Arizona or Jacksonville who desperately need quarterbacks.
That's how Matt Castle made all his money,
right?
And totally washed out. But of course, that doesn't matter to Bill Belichick or the New England Patriots. All that matters to is Kansas City Chiefs loathsome ability to judge players, and thanks for that. I appreciate that.
I know you love the Chiefs. Your favorite team.
They're 100 years of solitude for them will be a welcome gift to me every single year that they're terrible. And now that Andy Reid's
this is incidentally how I feel about the Washington Huskies.
Oh, right. So it's the same thing. But
I'm sure the Huskies will manage a solid 7 wins again this year.
Right, against such great competition.
Yeah.
And of course, the Chiefs will wind up with a couple of victories over the Raiders, and they might get to play the Rams or something like that to give them 3 to 4 more wins. But they don't have a position having the first pick in the draft where they're actually going to be able to improve their team substantially. It's going to be
there's quality defensive linemen and stuff out there, but not. It's not a year where you want to have a top 5 pick. Right. It's a year where you're totally fine with the 15 to 20 pick, but it's not a year where you want a top 5 pick. But what are you going to do? So
you got to take somebody.
So it's or a trade, but nobody's going to want to trade because there's just not that person. But okay, so we want to talk about 2 things here to kind of close this out. We're going to get to the playoffs, Super Bowl here in a second, but I wanted to have a brief conversation about the Hall of Fame. Which Hall of Fame voting will take place next weekend. It'll be, I believe, announced right before the Super Bowl. And you have a really interesting list of candidates. I want to just read the candidates out. I'm going to leave the two Veterans Committee nominees off because I never saw them play. But you have Larry Allen, Jerome Bettis, Tim Brown, Chris Carter, Eddie DeBartolo, Kevin Green, Charles Haley, Art Modell, Jonathan Ogden, Bill Parcells, Andre Reed, Warren Sapp, Will Shields, Michael Strahan, and Aeneas Williams. That's an impressive group of people. You can make a pretty strong case for any of them. I certainly think a stronger case than I'm still amazed that Curtis Martin got in the Hall of Fame last year. That's a very to me undefensible pick. But despite Curtis Martin did one good thing well, which was not get hurt and play for a long time, and he played in New York. But if he had but in any case, a dominant player, truly dominant player. No, any of these are better selections than Curtis Martin was. But I think that the big issue around the Hall of Fame right now is the receiver logjam. That you have a scenario where you have Tim Brown, Chris Carter, and Andre Reed, all quite similar receivers, all played at the same time, and the Hall of Fame voters seem to believe that you can't let these people in, or you can't vote for all of them. So they're making, Andre Reed's a Hall of Famer and Chris Carter isn't. Well,
there's no argument for that.
Yeah, there is no. First of all, Carter is superior to the other two, but also you can just vote them all in, right? You don't have to make these choices. And what's happening is it's caught. And it's not a crisis on the level of the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame, which is of course a joke. Jeff Bagwell may have been within 100 yards of steroids once, and he had big arms, so we cannot. He gets like 20% of the vote. So it's not on that level, but I think that that is something that needs to be. For people who care about the legacy of the game, it's something that needs to be dealt with, and hopefully these guys all get in.
It's one of those things. Chris Carter, when you look at what he was able to do when on Randall Cunningham's offense with the sheer amount of talent that was there, and still able to separate himself from the pack when you've got him, Jake Reed, and Randy Moss as your 3 receivers.
That was a great trio of receivers.
Absurd.
Yeah, that was a great. It's still amazing the team didn't never been to the Super Bowl.
Yeah, that was one of the happiest moments of my life when they lost to the Falcons.
Because you knew the Broncos could actually beat the Falcons.
Then the Broncos were going to win the Super Bowl, and there was no question about that.
Right.
And of course they did.
A terrible game.
It's a great game. That's not the point. You're Chris Carter, and you're able to separate yourself from that. Randall Cunningham's ability to run, and the unsung, real quality play that Robert Smith came at from the backfield.
Yeah. Who incidentally, if you've ever heard him interviewed, is the biggest jerk.
Bigger jerk than Chris Carter?
Oh, easily. Robert Smith is arguably the most arrogant, loathsome person I've ever heard on television, and that may include Skip Bayless.
Good frontman for The Cure, though.
Yeah, well, there.
You can't really argue with his ability to sing for The Cure.
Yeah.
But the idea that Chris Carter is not a Hall of Famer is absolutely absurd, and the fact that he's an NFL personality makes the whole thing even more strange.
Yeah.
Because Michael Strahan is going to get in without question in the first ballot, in my opinion. I don't know that he necessarily deserves it, but he, as an NFL personality, he played in New York. He had everything going for him.
But to the credit of the Hall of Fame voting committee, last year, they took a ton of criticism because they let in people like Cortez Kennedy. And Cortez Kennedy, obviously I'm biased because he's the greatest Seahawk ever. And that includes, Steve Largent, who of course went down after he became, the proto Tea Party congressman from Oklahoma, which was very devastating for a young Eric here. But
that guy.
But they were putting in people in like Cortez Kennedy. Much the outrage of the general public, who, as far as they're concerned, only thinks that somebody like Michael Strahan or Chris Carter should be in. And so it's entirely possible that somebody, Will Shields, who of course is a complete dominating guard with the Chiefs and very deserving candidate, will get in. And then there'll be this outrage because Michael Strahan's on TV and he has such a charming gap between his teeth.
Yeah, he pitches for Subway. For God's sake.
He hosts he replaces Regis on the morning show with Kelly Ripa.
What a guy! I mean, you guy like that. I mean, if he deserves to be there. I mean, he's on daytime TV.
Yeah,
I've heard of him, and that's part of the issue. Is I think with a lot of these people is that it's a question of who people have heard of.
Yeah,
and
so you have this disconnect between the public and the media on this, and that's to the media's credit. But at the same time, this logjam receiver standing, and the other, also to the media's discredit, is the idea that Charles Haley is not in the Hall of Fame. Which I'm sorry, I loathe the Cowboys deeply. Right? I mean, to me, like that is by even more than the Broncos. And I had to put up with this guy, the most obnoxious Broncos fan in history.
Go Broncos.
In all of history. And I still hate the Cowboys more. And living in Texas for 3 years certainly just reinforced that. But Charles Haley was an incredibly dominant player. The fact that Charles Haley was a massive jerk to the media should not matter.
Right,
and that's the only reason he's not in. And and I was really glad Richard Dent got in. I mean, I think that the Hall voters are, and this is of course at the root of the receiver issue, is they don't want to let in too many people from the same position. So you're looking basically this year at Charles Haley and Kevin Green as the big pass rushers. And I can't. Green was an excellent player, but I'd have trouble, at least in my mind, thinking of Green as a better player than Charles Haley.
No, Green's an idiot, and his later career in professional wrestling only serves to reinforce how horrible he was at a lot of things athletic, in my opinion. And basically,
I love your unhinged rant against Kevin Green.
He's a fool. And it's really frustrating to see him even mentioned in this list because while he was a starting linebacker for a lot of years,
he was a big sack man.
A big sack man like, say Warren Sapp or Strahan? No. He was a guy he was a one-dimensional player who would rush into the quarterback every single time.
Right.
He was not a tackler. He was not an interception man. He could not put that guy in coverage. He was a 1D player who, because of his long blonde hair, and I love blonde hair.
God knows.
But his long blonde hair...
Loomcast approves of blonde hair.
Absolutely. But
at this point, we would mostly approve of just hair.
Well, mostly. But in case you can't tell, I'm as blonde as Eric. But
much more well bearded. I have to say, I've broken new boundaries in this podcast. As the first person on LGM podcast to not have a beard, so it's very exciting.
And I don't think that's breaking new ground, but falling short.
It's fine.
But with Kevin Green, his long blonde hair and his pretty blue eyes and his ability to be shown on TV allows people to remember him for reasons that make no freaking sense on any level. I would probably rather have Art Modell, who outraged an entire city,
right. Modell should be banned just on principle,
thrown into the Hall of Fame, rather than some fool like Kevin Green.
Yeah. And I should say, to go back with the defensive line thing, the Patriots, it's Green, Haley, and Strahan, and they probably want to elect more than one of those, and it'd probably be Strahan. But,
right, and it's okay to elect more than one defensive lineman, but to elect more than one wide receiver is somehow reprehensible.
Yeah,
something
so we'll elect none of them, and then pretty soon you're going to have a whole new generation of great receivers, and these guys are going to be left behind. And the idea of Tim Brown, for instance, not in the Hall of Fame, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Well, and when you wind up, because of the increased passing rates in the NFL, you're going to wind up with Tim Brown, who's high on the list today, but in 10 years will be deep down 30, 40 in the list. And nobody at that point will remember him specifically from television. Nobody will say, oh, well, Tim Brown deserves it. Remember how good he was? Well, when you look at the statistics at that point, he won't look so sweet.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say about the Hall of Fame, which as you can tell is an issue that Daryl and I debate intensely for long periods of time, more so than probably any two people on the planet, but whatever, is that the Veterans Committee needs to nominate Ken Anderson to be in the Hall of Fame. That was a dominant quarterback for the Bengals, led him to 2 Super Bowls, and if you look statistically, he was better than Dan Fouts across the board. He was not in as innovative an offense as the Air Coryell offense. He didn't have the weapons that Dan Fouts did, but Ken Anderson was an amazing quarterback, and I think is probably the most underrated player of the 1980s. But we won't go on. We've been talking about the Hall of Fame now for only like 11 minutes, so we should probably talk about the playoffs and the Super Bowl. So I think that like several of the recent years, it's becoming almost like baseball, where you get into the playoffs and then it's just a crapshoot. Who knows who's going to win? And so you have a San Francisco team. It's not that surprising, particularly given that the NFC was maybe a little weak. Maybe that's overstated, but 49ers team is not that surprising, and a Ravens team that I think, frankly, is quite surprising, since I simply going into the playoffs did not take them seriously at all. So, before we get into the Super Bowl itself, I don't know if you have any thoughts about the playoffs and the games that you've seen.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe the idea that the Broncos could go to like 15 seconds left in the game and then have Raheem Moore blow it all. And I don't blame Raheem Moore entirely, even though that play was wretched and brainless and awful. And everything that every Browns fan wants to see happen to the Broncos.
Right.
There were a myriad of issues that went on in that game between John Fox and his play calling and Peyton Manning and his play. And
they really blew that game.
Losing Noshawn Moreno and being forced into some real second tier running backs and losing their running game. There's a lot of things.
Because at that point there was a thirst, because they had already lost McGahee and then they lose Moreno, so they have
they're left with Lance Ball
that doesn't give us not a lot of options.
What's his name? The point is that to see, it's a frustrating loss from a better team, and I think that then the Broncos are clearly on every piece of paper a better team than the Ravens. But it goes into what you were saying, that it becomes something of a crapshoot when you get into the playoffs. And I know everybody's super happy to see Ray Lewis on his final run to the Super Bowl, and everybody wants to see Mr. Double Murder go that's not Mr. Alleged Double Murder,
right? Okay,
go on and become a Super Bowl legend to play his final game there and become just what happened to John Elway.
Well, it is interesting, and we were kind of talking about this before the podcast, how certain players can rehabilitate an image and others can't. So you have a Ray Lewis, and Ray Lewis has admitted he was an idiot when he was a young man, and okay. But then you have a guy like Ben Roethlisberger, beloved NFL player / serial rapist.
He didn't have to do anything.
Versus somebody like Ndamukong Suh, or for that matter, Randy Moss, who never has actually committed any crimes. Right? At least, I don't think so. I don't think either one of them has. But are just these kind of loathed players for various reasons, and it's really interesting how willing people are to make, who they choose to make heroes and villains are. And obviously off the field behavior doesn't matter, given, of course, the massive amount of domestic violence committed by NFL players, as well as sexual violence and other crimes versus people who, by all accounts at least, seem to live fairly normal, unremarkable lives outside of football, at least as far as we know.
Well, how many exaltations of Jesus Christ is it going to take Ndamukong Suh to make to alleviate the idea that he was falling down and lifted his leg a little bit and happened to hit Matt Schaub in the groin, which was funny, by the way. But whether it was
you're a big fan of man who gets hit in groin by football.
Oh, my groin! But the idea that Ndamukong Suh is some loathsome figure because it's not like Jeremy Stevens when he kicked the guy in the groin.
Right.
He was with the Buccaneers, who just straight up went.
Speaking of absolutely loathsome people,
yeah,
I mean,
Jeremy Stevens, no number of exaltations of Jesus Christ, no number of Hail Marys will exonerate that man.
No. That's a bad actor.
Although he's now married to
Hope Solo. After beating her on their wedding night the night before.
She clearly shows herself as a classy human being.
Well, I mean, these things are
bad
scene.
But so how much does it take in Ndamukong Suh? How many times do you need to see him on the field dancing and screaming and invigorating the players, his teammates, to say, oh, wait, that guy's not a jackass. Yeah. That guy's a hero.
Yeah.
And that's what happened with Ray Lewis.
Yeah.
And so now he announces his retirement. He praises Jesus at the end of every game that they win. He cries, and he's emotional, and everybody loves it.
Now this is beside the point of the fact that Ray Lewis is one of the three best linebackers I've seen in my
incredible
30 years of
player.
football, along with Singletary and Lawrence Taylor.
No question about it.
I mean, an absolutely once in a lifetime.
But his talent, Ndamukong Suh's talent, doesn't come into his into his being liked or disliked. And really, Ray Lewis's talent doesn't come into whether he's liked or disliked. One of the best things Ray Lewis ever did was smash Rashard Mendenhall's collarbone on a form tackle.
Yeah.
3 years ago, because he's that damn good.
Yeah.
But nobody.
Not that that's actually a good thing. I mean, again, this gets into the larger problems of the NFL. But we should. We're sort of running out of time here. I know that the LGM readership will just love a repeat appearance of Loomcast. But we should talk a little bit about the Super Bowl. I will mention that, speaking of Ndamukong Suh, how does Jim Schwartz still have a job in Detroit? That was the worst coaching job I've ever seen.
Yeah, I mean, it's like a Matt Millen style.
right. Poor Detroit. But anyway, the Super Bowl. So, Niners, Ravens, thoughts?
Ravens defense, as lauded as it is old and slow, especially on the outsides.
Which is a problem.
When
you have Colin Kaepernick.
Yes, and when you've got Michael James. See what's basically going on here in my view is you've got Haloti Ngata, former Duck, who's amazing, and I love him.
Go Ducks!
But he's going to be left in the dust with what basically I feel like the 49ers are going to do is they're going to run Frank Gore up the middle, let Ngata take care of that, and then as soon as they do the fake, the zone reads and the fakes, and hand off to Michael James on the outside and let Colin Kaepernick go out on the outside, the agedness of the Ravens defense is going to show, and that comes on every level. You got Terrell Suggs, who's not that old but coming off injury. You've got Ed Reed coming out at safety, who is extremely old, great player, but extremely old.
Also Hall of Famer. But
and I think this is going to be not the kind of blowout that San Francisco laid onto the Broncos when they faced in the Super Bowl.
One of my favorite Super Bowls ever, of course. But
you and Browns fans. But I think it's going to be a fair beating.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. A couple things about the Ravens. One is that this idea that they fire Cam Cameron as their offensive coordinator in like week 11, and then they bring in Caldwell or promote him, I guess. and all of a sudden they take off, and so Jim Caldwell's now a genius, and I'm just really skeptical of this because it's the same plays, the same play calling. I mean, they may have needed a change, but Cam Cameron's by all accounts a very good offensive coordinator with a horrible college coach.
And 3 playoff wins aside, they did lose 4 of their last 5 regular season
games.
Right.
This is one of these
which
media
are
narratives.
4 of the last 5, which are the 5 games that Jim Caldwell was coordinator.
Yeah, so it's not
starting with the Denver.
So
game.
I think that these media narratives get so dominant in football, and now Jim Caldwell's a genius. Maybe he would have been interviewed for head coach, but the NFL stopped hiring black coaches again. So, there were 0 hired this year with an unusually large number of both coach and GM vacancies. So there's a lot of issues there. But so that's one of the issues. And the other is that, I'm not a gambling man. I like my vices, but not that one. And so, yeah. So, but it's really interesting that the line has decreased. If Niners are favored, that line has decreased fairly significantly. And the real reason is that people want Ray Lewis to win the Super Bowl.
Which goes back into that same issue of everybody looking at Ray Lewis as some superhero.
Yeah.
And he's not. He's simply a football player, and I'm not telling.
And as someone who saw a series of very questionable calls that helped Jerome Bettis win a Super Bowl against the Seahawks, and I admit the Seattle played a terrible game. But so I'm not really saying that the refs gave it to them, but I feel like when these narratives become dominant and everybody wants Jerome Bettis to go out with a Super Bowl, I get a little bit worried. But then as somebody who's a fan of the Blazers and having watched the Lakers, basically, the refs give the Lakers game after game sometimes, and move after move, even if they don't always work out. Like Dwight Howard was hilarious. I guess I can, although I avoid conspiracy theories in politics, conspiracy theories in sports appeal to the fan of a team, a fan of teams that always lose. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to say that we'll close on this, that I expect the 49ers to put some serious Raven heads on sticks. Maybe Ray Lewis, I'm not saying that, I'm just suggesting, maybe others. The Niners are going to take this, and I'm going to go, I don't think it's, the Ravens are a well-coached team, and I don't think it's going to be great, any kind of great blowout either, but I'll take 28-24 Niners.
I'm going to take 38-17.
Wow, that's a big blowout.
I think the Ravens offense, I think Ray Rice is going to be shut down by Navarro Bowman and Patrick Willis, who were 2 of the best linebacker combination, or basically the best linebacker combination in the game. And they are going to shut him down. They have speed on receiver, but the 49ers defense doesn't have a 37-year-old cornerback covering Torrey Smith.
Right, who's really become a dominant receiver this year, kind of out of nowhere.
But he's going to be put down. He's really their only hope, because Anquan Bolden, while a good receiver, is a possession guy and old, and they're going to need to come up with points fast because the San Francisco 49ers are going to put points on the board, and they're not going to hold back. It's going to be essentially a blowout. 38-17, 49ers.
Right. And so we'll close by simply noting that both Daryl and myself have probably used several metaphors in this podcast. So I'm not literally calling for Ray Lewis's head on the stick. I'm just suggesting that the Niners are going to win. And so this can be used as a metaphor. And so I just wanted to let our good friends, Michelle Malkin, Glenn Reynolds, know
you're all sweet people.
That you're not only are you nice people, but that we may have used a few metaphors here. So just be aware of that. Well, we'll close on that. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we will be back soon, no doubt, with another LGM podcast. So enjoy the Super Bowl, and we will talk to you later.
Loomcast.
Loomcast.